So really our vision of Indians and where they lived and how they lived is really not very accurate, because most Native Americans never lived like this. Only 9 Indian tribes actually did. Okay. Now, to have a house like this, you pretty much needed to be nomadic. Can somebody tell me what nomadic means? You know what nomadic means? You move around a lot. Why would you want to move around a lot? Sure, to hunt. And so, how would you move a house like this? Sure, you take it down, but how would you move it? Horses, right? You take it all down and you pack it on your horses, and the horses, feel free to come right over here, ma'am. Sit down right there. No, please do. And so, teepees then came with horses. Now, horses didn't originally come from North America. Where did the horses come from? Testing your knowledge today. Anybody know where horses came from? Horses came with the Spanish, right? The conquistadors came in the 16 and 1700s and really explored the West. They were all the way up into Montana and the Dakotas with their horses. The Indians saw those horses and thought they were pretty cool. And actually in 1697, a Navajo medicine man by the name of Powwow led a revolt against the Spanish, and they drove the Spanish out of New Mexico back into Mexico, but they kept all their horses and the sheep and the cattle. And so then the Indians were able to ride their horses and raise sheep and cattle. But before that, they didn't have it. What they lived in before that were kind of like teepees, but they were much smaller, probably, only about this tall, so that a few people would fit inside. Once they had horses, then they could all of a sudden have bigger houses that they hauled around with the horses. What do you think they used to haul their tents before they had horses? Themselves and their dogs. Yep, absolutely. They used dogs to haul things around. And so if you can think about this difference between the size of a dog and the size of a horse, you can see where their houses got bigger because they had bigger animals, right? A teepee got moved pretty often. If you were hunting buffalo and moving around the plains, chances were you were moving every 3 or 4 days because of 2 things. First of all, you're following the game. But second of all, a teepee this size probably took about 15 horses. So if you had 15 horses and your neighbors had 15 horses and your other neighbors had 15 horses, eventually you have a tribe with hundreds of horses, right? And horses eat grass pretty fast. And so you pretty much moved in order to feed your horses because you had to find pasture or green grass for your horses. Now in the wintertime you may not move as much, but you probably were stripping bark off of trees and doing things like that to feed your horses. Okay? So the horses were really critical to this. Indians only lived in teepees for about 150 years of their total history. So before that they lived in the other houses. And there are other kinds of houses that you'll hear of. Have you ever seen Pueblos? How many people have seen Pueblos? Or Hogans? Or I live in Utah, and the Utes out there lived in what they call wickiups, which is kind of a brush-looking structure that looks sort of like a teepee, but it's not. It's something that would just be a permanent structure. Okay.
Permanent structure.
A permanent structure, a wickiup. Yep. They would build them and then they lived in them all the time. They didn't move them around like a teepee. Yeah. Originally, teepees were made out of buffalo hide. It would take about 26 buffalo hides to make a teepee this size. And the poles are made out of what's called lodgepole pine. That's why it's called lodgepole, because it was actually a variety of pine tree that grows really tall and straight and doesn't have very many big branches, so they're easy to strip and to use. And they're very strong. Okay. Take 17 poles to put up a standard teepee. You're going to have the 15 here, and you got 2. When you go outside, look, those flaps up there have poles attached to the outside of them, and you can move those poles to open or close that space so that you can let air in, or rain in, or smoke out as you wanted to. Okay? Now, one of the things that's really most important about a teepee is you can actually build a fire in it. It's one of the only kinds of tents that you can build a fire. And how many of you been camping? Been camping? Yeah. Probably didn't build a fire inside your lodge, did you? Because the smoke would be pretty bad, right? Well, if we built a fire in here, the smoke would go out the top. And the reason is because of these blankets hanging here along the side. See, I have a rope here, and then I've tied blankets all along it and then staked them down. And if we closed that door so that it was all enclosed, what that does is it creates a chimney effect. What happens is the air goes and it hits those blankets and it comes up through here and it causes the air, just like in your chimney or your fireplace, the smoke to go right out on the top. And so that's one of the most important things on the teepee, is to actually put a liner in it. Now if you bought a modern teepee, it would have a fitted canvas liner that they actually manufacture to go in there and fit it perfectly. But originally they would use hides, or they'd use blankets like this, whatever they had, in order to make it warmer and to make sure that they had that draft. Questions about any of that? So what do you think these are? Well, they're actually chairs. They're called lazy backs. You can sit up against it if you wanted to. They're staked down to the ground so you can lean back and actually be pretty comfortable. A teepee this size would have had 8 to 10 people living in it. You'd have the main couple, and then you would have their children. You might have an unmarried sister or brother living with you. You probably had an older aunt or grandmother living with you. Usually there were more women around, especially at the end of life, than there were men. A lot of times because of warfare and the fact that the men were killed off. And so a man's responsibility was to take care of all of the women in his family unit. And so you'd often have a lot more women living in your teepee than we do today. Okay? The older grandmother, her job was really important. She did babysitting. She did a lot of the teaching of the children. She also, in the wintertime, slept over here next to the door, and her job was to put wood on the fire all night long so that nobody froze. Kept the teepee warm. And she was called the sleep by the door woman, and that was a really honored and important position.
She never got any sleep. Or maybe
But
during
she
the
also,
day.
well, maybe during the day, and she probably napped in between. But it was one of those things where everybody had their division of labor, and that was important for her. So, yeah. They were the babysitters. Yep, exactly. Yep. So there's a lot of interesting things in here. You see anything you want to have me describe?
I'd like
That's
to
a
know if you
good one.
painted your teepee.
This teepee belongs to the fort. It's a permanent installation here. You can tell because of the lights. They actually put tables in here. People eat dinner out here, I guess. So that's kind of interesting. But what she just picked up was a porcupine tail hairbrush. And the porcupine's tail does not have quills in it like the rest of his body. It's more like a bristle. And so you can use that to brush your hair. Cool. Yeah.
Is that a coyote?
It's a coyote. Yep.
Are these all original?
These are all reproductions. They're not old, but they're all my original pieces. I've made most of this stuff. This is my collection. For more than 20 years, I've been making and gathering things. Most of it is Cheyenne, 1860s, 1870s. That dress has shells on it. Let's talk about trade for a minute, because really the other thing that's important to this time period, along with the teepees, is that natives' lives were very much formed around trade. And originally, They were trading for things like knives and scissors and pots and pans and then guns, of course, but anything that would make their lives easier. What do you think the Indians had that the white men wanted? Fur. What kind of fur to begin with? Beaver, absolutely. The vast majority of the beaver that was captured in the West and shipped east was not trapped by white men. There were relatively few mountain men out here. The Native Americans captured a lot of beaver for trade to the white men. And then they would take them to the rendezvous of the trading ports, and then they would get the things that they needed.
So they did not use the hides themselves very much?
They would use them sometimes, but they actually preferred things like otter and buffalo. Yeah, otter, you see a lot of otter skin hats.
Why would they?
I don't know why. I can't tell you that. I just know they did. Yeah. But any fur-bearing animal, really, they did enjoy. They liked ermine. Ermine are little weasels that turn white in the wintertime, and then they have a little black tip on the tail. You see those a lot on like Blackfoot war shirts and things like that. Yep. Now, what happened when they ran out of beaver to trap? What did they trade for then? Buffalo, absolutely. So they switched from trapping beaver to hunting buffalo because they still wanted guns and pots and pans and scissors and beads and all of the things that the white men had, right? And so Indians actually slaughtered quite a few buffalo to trade the tongues and the hides, primarily, to white men who took them back east.
What do they use the tongues for?
Tongues were considered a delicacy. They ate them. And actually, smoked buffalo tongue is really good. It's very good. Yeah. Yep. So, you know, we have this vision that white people came out and slaughtered a lot of buffalo. Actually, the Indians slaughtered a lot of the buffaloes.
Yeah, but they used them.
They used not all of them. And they didn't use every piece of every buffalo.
Really?
I'll give you an idea.
Okay.
If I lived in a teepee like this, I'd have 26 buffalo hides to make my cover.
Right.
What am I doing with that many skulls, that many shoulder blades, that many? You can't, there's no physical way for you to use every piece of every buffalo. You used a lot of pieces of buffalo because you knew what the different parts were good for.
Right.
But they definitely were very wasteful. They did not. It is a myth that they used every piece of every buffalo. You can. There's
Really?
How are you going to haul around 26 skulls?
Sure, you know, and just everything you read,
Absolutely.
you know, about Native Americans.
Right.
You know, it sounded like they were so thrifty and made sure that every piece of the buffalo was used for something.
If they needed to, they did. But if they didn't, they left it laying on the prairie. And then, you know, who benefited from it? The scavengers, because the coyotes and the wolves and the fox and the weasels, and so that was fine until you got to the point where you were actually slaughtering hundreds of thousands of buffalo instead of hundreds of buffalo. But if you think about it, before they had horses, the other way they hunted buffalo was a buffalo jump. What's a buffalo jump? You drove a herd of buffalo off a cliff, and 10,000 buffalo would die at once. And we know that because they're still there. The bones are there, and they just they would go down and take the pieces and the parts they needed, and then they would leave the rest. Yeah.
What is this feather that's snipped like a zigzag design?
Those are attached to my war club. They liked feathers. They stylized them in a lot of different ways.
Interesting.
How did they?
No, those are actually rooster feathers that are intended to look like magpie feathers. You can't have magpie feathers now because it's a scavenger bird and they're illegal. It's just like hawks and eagles and things like that. Yeah.
I have one question.
Sure.
How did they get the buffaloes to run off?
Good question. Sometimes they would start the prairie on fire, and then the buffalo would run from the fire. There's actually a really good movie, it's maybe a TV series, called Into the West. And the very first part of that movie, they show this, where they would build these big brush fences that were intended to keep the buffalo running in a certain direction, and so you build these barricades, and then once you push the buffalo in there, they would just keep following the barricades until you got to the end, and they would just jump right off.
Centennial was, the book Centennial Industry book was great as far as that was concerned about the history of really Colorado especially, but it was really neat.
So, what else do you see in here that you might have questions about? That's my hat. That's a very traditional woman's headgear. You wore that when you were scraping hides or gathering wood to keep the sun out of your face.
What's it made of?
It's made out of rawhide. Yep. Buffalo rawhide. Once you scrape the hair off of a hide, you clean it up, you stretch it, and it gets hard like that. And they made a lot of different things out of it. They make a lot of containers out of it. And that was popular because if you're carrying your stuff around all of the time on your horses, it tends to get broken and or damaged. And so having something that was protective really helped.
What is this hanging right here?
The Rider Ricker squash, and then next to that is Timpsilo, which is a root vegetable. Squash, corn, and beans were native to the Americas, and they were very popular.
So they dry it like this and then throw it in their soup?
And throw it in them? Yep.
Interesting. Interesting.
Most of their food had to be dried because they didn't have a refrigerator or a freezer. And so meat was dried, berries were dried, vegetables were dried. Berries, they would take, there's another piece of rawhide there that looks like a half moon. You would actually put your berries inside there and you'd smash them up with a hammer, and then you lay them out in the sun and they dry really fast. If you tried to dry them whole, it would take more than a week, and sometimes they would rot before you were able to actually pack them up. If you had to move tomorrow, you wanted them dried today so that you could actually get rid of them.
What did they lay them on to dry them?
They would lay it on a hide or a piece of cloth or whatever they had.
Decorative metal, is that something that was traded for?
Yeah, they love metal. This is actually a Lakota style woman's drop belt, and those would have been traded probably with the Navajo, actually, with silver pieces. Then tacks like this, they would have gotten from white men.
Where did the Navajo get the silver?
The Navajo learned how to do silversmithing from the Spanish, but they actually mined silver in Mexico and New Mexico. That's how they made. So that's a copper cup. That would have been a trade item. Yep. Yep, they would have used pottery that they got from the white men. Pottery like this. This is called it's called a salt glaze on it, which is an old style glaze. But before that, how do you think they might have carried water before they had buckets or anything from the white men? They might have used the bladder. They usually probably used the pericardium, which is the heart sac. This is one of the ways they used all the pieces. And the reason is a bladder, when you get it wet, stretches. So you fill it with water, you hang it on your teepee liner, you wake up the next morning and it's hanging all the way down here because it's stretched. So hard for us to believe that our bladders actually will continue to stretch infinitely, but they will. I know a lot of times I feel like mine's going to burst, it won't. But the pericardium stays firm, and so it's round, and you just put a hoop around it, and it's easier to carry. But it also, even though it's waterproof and it'll hold the water, isn't very convenient. It doesn't seal like this, and you can't put it over a fire to boil it.
Sure, true.
So how do you boil your food? They would take the stomach of the buffalo, and they would build a tripod, which is 3 sticks, and they would hang that stomach on there, and they would fill it with water and their food. And then they would take hot rocks out of the fire and drop them in there, and the heat of the hot rocks actually boiled the water and cooked the food. And so it took a long time to cook because you had to add enough hot rocks to keep your food hot.
It didn't melt the gut.
No, it doesn't melt the gut. Nope. After a while, you got to dig the rocks out because it gets to be pretty heavy. But it's also, and I've done this, it's a very long, tedious, smelly,